I was about to give my son $900,000, but an overheard conversation made me decide to completely destroy his future. Hello everyone, my name is Garrick Vance. I am a retired structural safety engineer. For nearly 40 years of my life, I designed and inspected the safety profiles of massive steel and concrete bridges across the rugged, windswept landscapes of Washington state. I spent my youth suspended on metal scaffolding high above the icy gray waters of the Columbia River, checking for stress fractures in solid iron rivets, and recalculating the load limits of old railway crossings that had been battered by a century of heavy cargo trains. I knew exactly how a tiny invisible bubble in a steel weld could slowly propagate under the rhythmic, daily pounding of traffic, eventually leading to a catastrophic structural failure that would bring a 50-ton block of concrete crashing down without a single moment of warning. I spent years of my life working 60-hour weeks in the howling, freezing rain of the Pacific Northwest, climbing towering concrete piers, and examining high-tension suspension cables that held together the vital transportation arteries of the state. I understood gravity, shear stress, and thermal expansion better than anyone. I spent my life in a world of absolute physical constants, a world where there was no room for error, because a single cross-threaded bolt or a minor calculation error could mean the difference between a safe crossing and a tragic disaster. I was a man of concrete, steel, and mathematical certainty. My entire life had been governed by the strict, unforgiving laws of physics and structural integrity. But for all my mechanical expertise, for all my ability to predict the physical breaking points of cold metal, I was completely blind to the fact that the moral structure of my own family was rotting from the inside out. 3 years ago, my beloved wife, Genevieve, passed away after a long and courageous battle with cancer. She was the absolute anchor of my existence, a woman of gentle grace, soft-spoken dignity, and an unbreakable inner resilience. For 44 years we had walked hand in hand, sharing a life built on trust, hard labor, and mutual respect. On her deathbed, as the monitor beeps slowed down and her breathing became shallow, she held my hand with her remaining strength, looked into my eyes, and whispered, "Garrick, promise me you'll look after Dorian. He has a good heart, but he's too soft. Protect him from the coldness of this world." I wept, kissed her forehead, and swore an absolute oath that I would be his shield, his unshakable foundation, no matter what it cost me. When she took her last breath, my entire world suffered a catastrophic structural failure. The house we had built together, the memories we had woven, all of it suddenly felt hollow, like a grand cathedral whose arches had been stripped of their load-bearing supports. Only Dorian remained. Dorian was our only son, our pride and joy, a boy who had inherited his mother's soft, gentle eyes but also a certain dangerous compliance, a deep-seated desire to please that could easily be bent and twisted into weakness by a stronger, more predatory hand. In my overwhelming grief, I threw myself into protecting Dorian, determined to be the absolute physical and financial foundation for his future. I wanted to make sure he never had to experience the raw, terrifying financial struggles that Genevieve and I had endured in our youth. I decided to transfer all of my life savings to him and his wife, Saskia. It was $900,000, an enormous, staggering sum of money that represented every single drop of sweat, every tear, and every sleepless night I had spent on freezing construction sites and towering bridge decks during my career. I had worked 60-hour weeks in the howling Puget Sound wind, saving every penny, investing wisely, all so that my only child could have the perfect, unshakable launchpad for his life. I had completed all the legal paperwork. The certified bank check was tucked neatly inside the inner pocket of my heavy, worn-out canvas coat. The comprehensive trust documents already bore my signature, crisp and final. All I had to do was drive over to their house, hand over the folder, and watch the joyful, astonished smiles light up their faces. I truly believed that this grand gesture of unconditional love would secure my legacy and guarantee a peaceful, quiet old age, surrounded by my children and future grandchildren. But life does not operate according to the dry physical laws of structural engineering. A hidden, toxic crack had appeared in the foundation of my family without my knowledge. Instead of handing over that $900,000 in life savings, I spent the following week orchestrating a silent, devastating financial demolition that they never saw coming. Welcome back to Whispered Truths. Grab yourself a warm cup of coffee, a few snacks, get comfortable, and remember, the people in these stories had every opportunity to do the right thing. They simply chose otherwise. Leave a comment with the number 1 in the section below so we can keep our family of listeners growing. And make sure to hit that subscribe button. You are going to absolutely enjoy the sheer precision of this one. Betrayal never comes from only one side. It builds slowly, accumulating in the microscopic, invisible cracks of daily life, gnawing away at trust until a single moment of high-pressure stress causes the entire system to collapse in an instant. The feeling is exactly like a massive steel load-bearing beam snapping in half under an unbearable concentrated load. A sound of tearing metal that is both deeply painful and terrifyingly final. Let me tell you about the day the structure of my life was completely deformed. The day I stood in front of my son's house on a gloomy Friday afternoon. I stood outside Dorian's suburban Seattle home, holding a thick manila folder against my chest. The sky above was a heavy bruised gray, dripping with a cold, relentless drizzle that splayed across the manicured lawn. I wanted to surprise them. I didn't want to call ahead or knock loudly on the door. I wanted to walk in using the spare key they had given me, slide the folder onto the kitchen island, and witness their raw, unscripted shock. I stepped onto the porch, my boots squeaking softly against the wet wood. But as I reached for the brass handle, my hand froze in midair. A sound slipped through the narrow, half-inch gap in the sliding glass patio door. It was Saskia's laughter, sharp, cold, and piercing. A sound that carried absolutely none of the warm, gentle affection she usually directed toward me when she wanted something. She was on the phone, and the speaker was turned up so loud that the calculated, confident voice of the man on the other end came through the glass with chilling clarity. They were discussing the creation of a shell company, a front LLC designed to move large sums of capital without leaving a trace. Saskia laughed loudly, her voice dripping with an ugly, triumphant mockery. "The old man is completely clueless," she sneered, her words slicing through the cold afternoon air like a razor blade. "He's about to fall straight into the trap." That old man was me. The father standing outside trembling on the porch, with a check that represented a lifetime of hard labor. The moment that $900,000 hits the account, we're transferring it directly into the Shell LLC, and from there it goes straight into the purchase of the luxury penthouse downtown. And the best part? The deed will be solely in my name. I stood there on the porch, my entire body turning as cold as the concrete beneath my feet. Every single safety engineering instinct in my brain screamed at me, analyzing the terrifying structural failure of the words I was hearing. But what made my heart truly bleed, what felt like a physical knife twisting between my ribs, was not Saskia's monstrous greed. It was the heavy, submissive sigh of agreement that came from Dorian. My son, the child I once carried in my arms, the boy whose very life I had protected with my own body during a dangerous hiking accident in the Cascade Mountains when he was just 10 years old, was sitting directly across from her. I could see his dark silhouette cast against the frosted glass of the study window. He didn't defend me. He didn't shout at her to stop speaking about his father with such disgusting contempt. Instead, he let out a weak, tired sigh and spoke a sentence so cold it permanently shattered my soul. "I know," Dorian muttered, his voice flat and devoid of any spine. "Dad has become such an annoying nuisance lately. He's starting to lose his mind anyway, always forgetting where he put his keys and rambling about his bridge safety projects. Honestly, putting him in a full-time memory care facility is the best option for all of us. Your plan is absolutely perfect, Saskia. Just make sure the paperwork is airtight. Once he's locked away, we won't have to deal with his constant checking in on us. An annoying nuisance. A confused, decaying old man who needed to be locked away in a concrete room." That was how my own blood described the very foundation that had supported his entire life. The father who had spent his youth working in dangerous conditions to ensure his comfort. I felt a tight, suffocating band squeeze around my chest. It felt as though every supporting column in the house of my youth was splitting apart under an impossible weight. Betrayal from strangers can wound your pride, but betrayal from your own blood is the fatal blow that destroys the structure from within. They had absolutely no idea I was standing right behind that door, shivering in the cold Seattle rain. They continued to talk enthusiastically, painting detailed pictures of the high society life they would live with my money, laughing at my old age, my worn-out truck, and my naive, trusting nature. Saskia was twirling her expensive wedding ring on her finger, urging Dorian to quickly complete the petition to declare me mentally incompetent. They wanted to lock me away, to strip me of my basic civil rights, and to take control of every single dollar I had built over 40 years. The initial, agonizing pain in my chest slowly faded, and in its place came a quiet, freezing sensation that ran straight down my spine. Every single ounce of parental warmth and compassion I had carried for my son evaporated into the cold, damp air. A massive crack had opened in the glass, and I knew with absolute engineering certainty that this structure could never be saved. It was past the point of reinforcement. It was past the point of salvage. I looked down at the folder in my hands, then I smiled. The cold, quiet smile of a demolition specialist. They wanted a game. I would give them an absolute war. But I would never step into that house again. I turned around and walked away in silence. I walked down the stone steps of the porch, each footstep feeling as heavy as a lead weight against the wet concrete. The rain seemed to fall faster now, a cold needle-like spray that stung my cheeks, but I barely felt it. The laughter of Dorian and Saskia still echoed vividly in my mind, a grating, screeching noise that played on a loop in my head. I headed straight to my pickup truck, climbed into the cabin, and shut the heavy metal door. Instantly the world fell silent, save for the rhythmic heavy sound of my own ragged breathing. I sat there in the dark cabin, the gray Seattle light casting long bleak shadows across the dashboard. I looked into the rearview mirror. My face was old and deeply lined with wrinkles, but my eyes no longer carried the soft, gentle warmth of a father. They had turned as cold and unyielding as hardened structural steel. My capacity for forgiveness had officially reached its absolute breaking point. I opened the manila folder resting on my lap. The $900,000 check lay quietly inside, pristine and white. It had once been a symbol of my unconditional love, my willingness to sacrifice my own comfort for their future. Now it was nothing more than fuel for the greed of two ungrateful predatory people. My fingers touched the edge of the paper, and with a slow, deliberate motion I began to tear it. The ripping sound echoed through the cramped cabin, sharp, clean, and absolute. It sounded exactly like a steel support beam snapping in half under an unbearable concentrated load. I shredded the check into hundreds of tiny pieces, letting them drift down onto the floor mat like worthless confetti. Then I tore apart the trust documents as well, watching the scraps of my shattered dreams flutter and fall. I watched the white paper shards cover the black rubber matting, knowing that with every tear, I was completely severing my connection to the son who had just betrayed me. The pain inside me lasted exactly 4 minutes and 12 seconds, the precise time it took for me to drive from my son's house to the main highway. I timed it, my mind tracking the seconds with the mechanical precision of an engineering stopwatch. At the 13th second afterward, the structural engineer inside me took complete control of my mind. I didn't cry. I didn't turn back to scream or demand answers. That would have been pointless. When a structure has rotted from its foundation, trying to repair the drywall only wastes time and energy. The only rational solution is a controlled demolition. It has to be brought down with absolute clinical precision, using their own weight and greed as the explosive charges. I started the truck, the engine roaring to life with a healthy, robust growl. I pressed the accelerator and drove out into the light rain of the late afternoon, heading straight toward downtown Seattle. My mind was operating like a supercomputer, plotting the exact structural blueprint for Dorian and Saskia's future. They believed I was a weak, senile old man who could easily be manipulated into a concrete cell. That was their fatal error. They had forgotten who I was. I was the man who had built structures capable of surviving major earthquakes. I was about to show them what a structural engineer could do when he decided to tear something down. I would not use violence. I would use the law and their own insatiable greed as the explosives. My destination was the office of Thaddeus Briggs, the place where the true turning point in their lives would begin. Thaddeus had been my closest friend since our freshman year at the University of Washington. A man who had stood beside me at Genevieve's funeral and held my arm when my knees threatened to buckle. He knew the absolute depth of my love for Dorian, and he knew the incredible sacrifices I had made to accumulate that $900,000. I pushed open the heavy mahogany door of his office, smelling the familiar, comforting scent of old leather books and strong, bitter coffee. The moment Thaddeus saw the icy, calculated expression on my face, his professional posture shifted. He stood up, closed the door, and gestured for me to sit. "Garrick," Thaddeus said quietly, pouring me a cup of black coffee. "You look like you're about to demolish a bridge. What's happened?" I sat down, set my coffee mug on the table, and got straight to the point. "Thaddeus, I want a full, comprehensive audit of every single bank account, credit line, and investment trust that Dorian and Saskia have ever had access to. And I need it done today." Thaddeus didn't ask a single unnecessary question. He knew me too well. He sat down at his computer terminal, his fingers flying across the keyboard as he accessed the secured financial databases we had established years ago under my corporate holdings. For the next 2 hours, lines of complex financial data and banking ledgers scrolled across the screen in a silent, blinding stream. Every single number that appeared felt like another steel bolt being driven into my chest, but I didn't flinch. I watched the screen with cold, analytical focus. The confidential audit uncovered a series of horrifying, systematic betrayals that went far beyond their conversation on the porch. Over the course of the past year, Saskia had secretly used a secondary credit card account I had opened for Dorian's emergency business expenses. She had systematically made unauthorized cash withdrawals totaling $62,000. And that was not the worst of it. Thaddeus suddenly stopped scrolling, his face hardening as he pointed to a flashing red indicator on the screen. "Garrick, look at this," Thaddeus whispered, his voice tight with professional anger. "There is a pending, high-priority transfer request on your primary retirement investment fund. Dorian has initiated a manual transfer of $300,000 using a forged digital authorization code. The transaction was scheduled while you were driving over to his house this afternoon. They aren't even waiting for you to sign the trust. They are trying to drain you completely dry while you're still walking around." I stared at the glowing numbers on the monitor, my engineering mind instantly locating the critical load-bearing weakness in their plan. They were desperate for cash. They had already committed to the purchase of the luxury penthouse downtown, and they needed my $900,000 to keep their fraudulent shell company, Vanguard Development LLC, from collapsing under the weight of its own lies. They believed I was a confused, grieving retiree who knew nothing. They thought I was still carrying around a certified check, waiting to hand them my life savings on a silver platter. I could see the structural cracks multiplying in real time, and I knew that this building was ready to fall. I looked at Thaddeus, and my voice went as cold as the Siberian wind. "They think they are playing chess with a decaying mind, Thaddeus. Let's show them what happens when the pieces they are playing with belong to the board's designer." I turned toward Thaddeus, a slow, freezing smile spreading across my face. "Freeze that $300,000 retirement transfer immediately, Thaddeus. But do it silently. Don't trigger any system alerts, and don't make a scene. We're going to let them believe the transaction is still processing. And then, we're going to give them another path. A path that leads straight off a cliff. We're going to give them exactly what they're asking for. But hidden inside it will be a financial Trojan horse that burns their world to the ground." Thaddeus understood my design in an instant. A look of surprise and admiration flashed across his face. He leaned back in his leather chair, swirling the cold coffee in his mug. "Garrick, you're not just a structural engineer," he laughed softly, a low, rumbling sound. "You're a tactical designer. This is brilliant. If we draft this as a standard family trust, they can easily tie us up in probate court for years, claiming you weren't of sound mind when you made it. But if we structure it as a commercial development loan, they have absolutely no defense. It's a completely different legal territory." We opened a new document on his terminal, and together we began drafting the technical blueprint for the perfect trap. It was not an ordinary gift agreement or a family trust deed. It was a highly structured commercial business financing contract. Thaddeus's fingers clattered rapidly across the mechanical keyboard, the sharp clicking sound echoing through the quiet office as he pulled up old commercial lending templates and modified them to fit our exact needs. We spent hours refining the terminology, ensuring that every loophole was closed and that the financial obligations were locked down with absolute legal concrete. The lending party was Aegis Capital Partners, an investment fund that Thaddeus and I had created specifically for this plan. Legally, the $900,000 would be transferred into Saskia's shell company, Vanguard Development LLC. But attached to the money were extraordinarily strict conditions. The funds could be used only for the development of a legitimate commercial business project. If they used even a single dollar to purchase a private residential penthouse or cover personal expenses, the trap would immediately spring shut. The contract defined such actions as federal financial fraud, grand larceny, and systematic elder exploitation. I studied every clause carefully. The black text stood out sharply against the white pages. To an ordinary person, those clauses looked like standard dry business agreement boilerplate. But to an engineer, those clauses were hydraulic charges strategically installed at the most critical load-bearing joints of their lives. The moment Saskia touched that money and redirected it for unauthorized purposes, the alarm system would activate, federal investigators would become involved, and it would immediately become a criminal matter. No attorney in the country would be able to save them. The details of the contract were extremely specific. Appendix C, on page 74, laid out the precise tracking mechanisms. Every wire transfer initiated from Vanguard Development's bank account would require a double-factor authorization from the escrow agency, verifying the commercial business purpose of the funds. Any deviation, any attempt to bypass this protocol, would instantly trigger a security lock and send a digital alert to the bank's compliance unit. They had designed their shell company to hide assets, But they had absolutely no idea that by accepting this Aegis Capital loan, they were inviting a permanent federal monitor straight into their system. Thaddeus looked up from his desk, his hand hovering over the keyboard. He asked whether I was absolutely certain I wanted to proceed. If I signed, I would have to pretend to be a confused, senile old man in front of my own son to get them to sign without reading the fine print. I didn't hesitate. I picked up the pen and signed on behalf of the investment fund. The pain inside me had completely disappeared. At that moment, I was simply an engineer performing his job, demolishing a structure that had already rotted beyond repair. I understood Dorian and Saskia's psychology perfectly. Greed would completely blind them. The moment they saw the figure of $900 prominently displayed on the first page, they would never bother reading the detailed provisions buried in the appendices. They would sign immediately, believing they had outsmarted this old man. They would congratulate themselves on how easily their plan to place me in a nursing home was succeeding. I closed the folder, slipped the duplicate copy into my heavy coat pocket, and shook Thaddeus's hand. He wished me luck. It was 2 in the morning when I walked out of the law office into the quiet, stark Seattle streets. The city outside had fallen asleep, but inside me a silent, focused fire was burning. I took out my phone and sent Dorian a short, simple message. I miss you guys. I'd love to come over for dinner tomorrow night to give you your special gift. Dorian's reply arrived in less than 60 seconds, filled to the brim with artificial sweetness. We can't wait to see you, Dad. We've prepared your favorite roast beef. See you at 7. I put my phone away and smiled. Tomorrow night's dinner would be the moment I personally handed them Pandora's box. They would open it with excitement, completely unaware of the devastating storm that was waiting inside. I arrived at Dorian's front door at exactly 7 o'clock the following evening. I had deliberately chosen to wear my oldest, most sack-colored canvas work coat, the one with the frayed cuffs and grease stains from my engine work. I slouched my shoulders forward, let my head droop slightly, and dragged my feet as I walked up the concrete steps, projecting the perfect tragic image of an exhausted, rapidly declining senior citizen. When the door swung open, Saskia greeted me with the brightest, most radiant smile I had ever seen on her face. It was a beautiful, dazzling mask of affection, but my eyes immediately locked onto a single glittering detail that confirmed every word of Thaddeus's audit. Around her slender neck hung a stunning, brilliant diamond tennis necklace that sparkled magnificently under the entryway lights. It was a piece of jewelry worth tens of thousands of dollars, a lavish, high-end purchase she had made using the exact $62,000 she had systematically stolen from my secondary credit account. She had used my stolen retirement savings to buy herself diamonds, and now she had the sheer, unadulterated shamelessness to wear that very necklace while welcoming me into her home. The sight of it hit me like a bucket of freezing ocean water thrown directly into my face, but I did not let a single trace of emotion breach my defenses. I buried the cold, roaring rage deep within my chest, taking on the persona of the senile, harmless old man they believed me to be. I stepped inside with deliberately shaky, unsteady footsteps, letting Dorian take my worn coat as I mumbled a few incoherent, fragmented phrases about the heavy traffic on the bridge. The interior of their house was decorated with an aggressive, showy luxury. Plush velvet sofas, marble-topped side tables, and expensive abstract paintings that looked completely devoid of any real soul. It was a home built entirely on appearances, a structure with no real foundation, and it matched Saskia's personality perfectly. There was absolutely no history in this house, no warmth, no items that carried any sentimental value, only a cold, transactional presentation of money. The dinner table was set with their finest china and crystal glasses, a lavish spread that they had clearly prepared to grease the wheels of their deception. Throughout the meal, Dorian was the picture of filial devotion, continuously placing the finest cuts of roast beef onto my plate, pouring my water, and asking about my health in a sweet dripping tone that made my stomach churn with nausea. Meanwhile, Saskia sat beside him, her foot tapping restlessly against the hardwood floor beneath the table, her green eyes flashing with an intense, greedy impatience as she stared at the pocket of my jacket where the folder was supposed to be. I played my part flawlessly. I pretended to struggle with my fork, let my hands tremble slightly as I raised my water glass, and muttered a series of rambling, nonsensical stories about old engineering projects I had completed 30 years ago. I watched their eyes meet across the table, brief, victorious glances passing between them, subtle smirks that said, "He's completely gone. This is going to be incredibly easy." They truly believed that my mind was crumbling, that my memory was turned to ash, and that their plan to lock me away in a nursing home would require absolutely no effort at all. Finally, as the dessert plates were cleared, I let out a heavy, theatrical sigh and placed my hand gently against my forehead, squinting as if trying to recall a distant, foggy memory. I brought something for you guys, I muttered, my voice weak and slightly slurred. My mind, it's been a bit cloudy lately, but I wanted to make sure you had the foundation for your new business, your real estate company. With trembling, uncertain fingers, I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out the thick blue folder bearing the logo of Aegis Capital Partners. I slid it slowly across the polished wooden table. Saskia's hand shot out like a striking viper, snatching the folder before it had even come to a complete stop. Her eyes dilated with pure, unadulterated greed as she flipped directly to the page displaying the figure of $900,000. Exactly as Thaddeus and I had predicted, her mind, blinded by the sight of almost $1 million, completely ignored the appendix pages filled with fine print conditions at the back. She had no idea that she was smiling at a sentence while believing it was a winning lottery ticket. Saskia was practically vibrating with excitement, her fingers continuously smoothing the fabric of her expensive silk dress as she hovered over the folder. She had already pulled out her gold-plated designer pen, holding it with a tight, white-knuckled grip that revealed the absolute desperation of her greed. I watched her glance at Dorian, her eyes flashing with a sharp, warning glare that commanded him to stay silent and let her handle the old man. Dorian sat there, looking down at his plate, his face a pale, embarrassed mask of cowardice, as he watched his wife prepare to steal his father's life savings. They signed their names on every single compliance page, their pens scratching frantically against the paper, with an aggressive, desperate speed, completely unaware that they were signing their own names onto a federal arrest warrant. The two of them hurriedly, frantically signed the contract, their fingers shaking with the desperate urgency of thieves who were terrified their victim might wake up and change his mind. They signed every single signature page with rapid, sloppy strokes of ink, completely unaware that they were driving the final nails into the coffin of their own financial futures. I collected my signed copy of the agreement with a weak, trembling hand, carefully slipping it back into the inner pocket of my worn coat. I stood up slowly, mumbling that I was feeling incredibly tired and needed to get back to my house before the heavy fog rolled in off the bay. Dorian and Saskia escorted me all the way to the front door, their faces flushed with triumph, treating me with an exaggerated, patronizing level of respect and courtesy that was sickening to witness. As I climbed into the cabin of my Ford F-250 and turned the key, I glanced back through the narrow gap in the living room curtains. The two of them were embracing, laughing hysterically, and dancing wildly around the room in celebration. They believed they had just defeated the old man. They believed a life of absolute luxury, expensive champagne, and $1 million penthouse was waiting just ahead of them. But as I shifted the truck into drive and drove out into the dark, misty night, I knew exactly how long their joy would last. The silent hydraulic charges had been laid, the digital detonator had been activated, and their very next move would bring their entire world crashing down. 3 days after that dinner, Dorian unexpectedly arrived at my house. He wasn't with Saskia, he came alone, his face carefully arranged to look deep with filial concern, but the frantic, erratic twitching of his eyes betrayed an intense underlying nervousness. He was carrying a thick, heavy stack of legal documents bound in a professional blue cover. It was the formal petition seeking to have me declared mentally incompetent, an emergency legal filing that would strip me of my civil rights, name Dorian as my absolute financial guardian, and allow them to legally commit me to the Cascade Crest Memory Care Facility. They wanted to legitimize their theft of the $900,000, and they wanted me locked behind security doors before the end of the week. Dorian sat down across from me at the kitchen table, leaning forward as he began speaking in a gentle, persuasive tone. He told me that my memory had been getting progressively worse lately, that my rambling stories about bridge inspections were a sign of deep cognitive decline, and that I needed special, professional care in a place better equipped to look after me. Then, he slid a pen in the thick stack of paperwork across the table. He looked into my eyes with a face that pretended to be filled with love, telling me that all I had to do was sign, and he would take care of everything else. I looked at my only son, the boy I had raised, and at that moment my heart felt completely empty. Not a single trace of parental warmth remained in my chest. He was standing there, personally helping build a concrete prison wall around the father who had sacrificed his entire life to give him a future. He looked around the kitchen, his eyes stopping briefly on the old framed photos of our family hiking trips in the Cascades. But his face remained completely unmoved. The poison of Saskia's greed had completely eroded any sense of moral responsibility in his soul. As I sat there looking at him, Memories of his childhood flashed through my mind like a slide projector in a dark room. I remembered the night he had a high fever at age 5, and I stayed awake for 36 hours straight, wrapping him in cool towels and praying to God to take my life instead of his. I remembered working double shifts in the freezing winter wind at the shipyards just to buy him the specific brand of computer he wanted for his computer science classes. I had poured my blood, my sweat, and my very soul into this boy, wanting nothing more than for him to grow up to be an honest, strong, and compassionate man. And now he was sitting across from me, smiling warmly while handing me the pen that would strip me of my freedom. I thought about the solemn oath I had made to Genevieve on her deathbed, swearing to protect him from the coldness of this world. But at this moment, staring at his slick, transactional eyes, I realized that protecting him did not mean enabling his moral suicide. By allowing him to successfully lock me away and consume my wealth, I would be destroying his soul. Real structural restoration sometimes requires cutting away the completely rotted components, no matter how much it hurts. It was a complete, devastating structural failure of his character. He kept adjusting his silk necktie, his eyes dacing to his gold watch as if he had somewhere much more important to be, completely unbothered by the gravity of what he was doing to his own father. I didn't argue. I didn't show anger. Instead, I pretended to stare around the room in absolute vacant confusion, letting my jaw hang slightly slack. I let my eyes wander focusless, mumbling something about how the bridge cables were losing tension under the winter frost, and how the structural rivets were starting to rust away in the damp air. I picked up the pen with deliberately trembling, unsteady hands. I began to sign, but I did not sign my real name. I used a highly specialized technique that attorney Thaddeus Briggs had instructed me to follow, a signature designed specifically to prove legal coercion. I intentionally misspelled my middle name, changing Edward to Edward, adding an extra letter that had never appeared on any of my legal identification cards. I abandoned my normal cursive handwriting and switched to crude, childish block letters. I signed with an agonizing slowness, letting my hand shake so violently that the black ink smeared in several places across the signature line. Dorian stared at the pen, practically holding his breath as the metal tip scratched against the paper. The moment I finished the final, messy stroke, he immediately reached across the table and snatched the document from my hands. A massive, relieved smile broke across his face, and his chest expanded with a triumphant sigh. He thought he had successfully deceived me. He thought he had officially locked the door to my freedom and secured his absolute control over my wealth. He quickly gathered the paperwork, stood up, and left the house with the arrogant confidence of a man who believed he had just conquered a kingdom. But he was wrong. That petition, carrying a clumsy block letter signature and an intentionally misspelled middle name, would never have the legal power to harm me. On the contrary, under Washington state law, a radical departure from an individual's established signature style on a document of that caliber is a massive red flag. It serves as powerful, undeniable evidence that the signer was acting under intense psychological pressure, coercion, and was not acting voluntarily. By rushing out of my house with that paper, Dorian had just handed me the final crushing piece of evidence I needed to complete my demolition of their lives. It was the absolute proof of their conspiracy. If you've made it this far, then this story has probably stirred a few emotions. Please help us with one quick favor. Like and subscribe. Leave a comment with the number 5 so I know you've watched this far. And tell me what you think the final outcome of the story will be to see whether your prediction is correct. Many people watch without doing so, but it costs nothing and means a great deal to us. I stood by the window of my kitchen and watched Dorian's vehicle disappear down the road. Tomorrow was Monday. It was the day Saskia had scheduled an appointment with the Pacific Crest Realty office to sign the final purchase agreement for the luxury penthouse. An apartment that would be titled solely in her name, using the money she believed she had successfully secured from my account. They thought tomorrow would be their coronation. They had no idea that Thaddeus and I would be there as well, and we had already prepared a very special presentation for them. Monday morning, the downtown Seattle real estate office of Pacific Crest Realty was flooded with bright, harsh sunlight. The air inside was thick and suffocating, smelling of expensive mahogany polish, leather chairs, and the heavy designer perfume Saskia was wearing. She sat confidently in a luxurious leather chair, her fingers lightly drumming on the table. Dorian sat beside her, his face glowing with the smug happiness of a man who believed he was about to reach the absolute summit of high society life. On the table lay the final purchase contracts for a luxury penthouse worth nearly $1 million. The real estate agent, a young, well-groomed man who looked eager to close his biggest deal of the quarter, smiled warmly, and slid the contract toward Saskia. She picked up an elegant, gold-plated fountain pen with her slender fingers, the diamond tennis necklace around her neck sparkling brilliantly beneath the office lights. Saskia glanced proudly at Dorian, her eyes shining with triumphant arrogance. She was preparing to sign her name and claim the stolen money, believing that from this moment forward, her life was entering a new chapter of absolute wealth. But the instant the metal tip of her pen touched the paper, the heavy glass door of the office suddenly swung open. Two people walked inside, Thaddeus Briggs and I. The triumphant smile on Saskia's face froze instantly, her eyes widening in absolute shock. Dorian jumped to his feet, his chair scraping loudly against the floorboards as he stared at me in complete disbelief. I was no longer wearing the old grease-stained canvas coat. I was no longer moving with the trembling, unsteady steps of a senile old man. I stood perfectly straight, dressed in a sharp, tailored three-piece black suit. I looked less like a frail retiree and more like a chief safety engineer inspecting a major high-profile construction project. My eyes remained fixed on them, cold, sharp, and entirely unyielding. "Dad?" Dorian stammered, his voice cracking with a sudden rising panic. His gaze shifted frantically toward the thick folder in Thaddeus's hand, and the blood drained from his face as he realized that my confused, senile behavior over the past 3 days had been nothing more than an act. He tried to take a step toward me, his hands reaching out in a desperate, pleading gesture, but his voice died in his throat as he met my cold, analytical gaze. I walked slowly to the conference table, pulled out a heavy leather chair, and calmly sat down directly across from them. Thaddeus placed his leather briefcase on the table, opened the brass latches with a sharp, echoing click, and looked directly at the real estate agent. "Halt this transaction immediately," Thaddeus commanded, his voice carrying the absolute, freezing authority of a federal prosecutor. The real estate agent stared at us in complete confusion, his hand hovering over the contracts. Only then did Saskia recover from her shock, her deep-seated arrogance and greed quickly returning. She slammed her hands down onto the polished wood, stood up, and pointed a trembling finger at me, screaming at the top of her lungs that I had absolutely no right to interfere. She insisted that the $900,000 had already been legally transferred into her LLC, and that the financing agreement had been officially signed by both parties. I didn't bother arguing with her. I didn't raise my voice. I simply looked at Thaddeus and nodded. Thaddeus responded with a cold, professional smile. He reached into his briefcase and removed a heavy, formal document bearing the official red seal of a federal financial regulatory agency. In a clear, booming voice, he made the formal announcement. The entire $900,000 held in the account of Vanguard Development LLC had been officially frozen 2 hours earlier. The reason? Irrefutable evidence of financial misconduct, systematic elder exploitation, and the illegal diversion of restricted commercial business loan proceeds for unauthorized personal real estate acquisitions. The color drained from Saskia's face instantly, her green eyes turning hollow and lifeless. The elegant fountain pen slipped from her fingers, clattering loudly onto the floorboards and rolling away. Dorian staggered backward, his knees buckling slightly as he collapsed back into his chair. In the absolute suffocating silence of the room, the rapid, terrified pounding of their hearts could practically be heard by everyone present. Their grand high society coronation had transformed into a courtroom. But that was not the worst of it. Thaddeus reached into his briefcase once more and withdrew a second document. A single piece of paper that would permanently detonate the remainder of their carefully constructed world. It was an emergency arrest warrant. Behind us, the heavy glass door opened again, and two uniformed police officers stepped into the room, their silver badges gleaming under the bright lights. Saskia let out a piercing, hysterical scream, grabbing the edge of the table to keep herself from collapsing onto the floor. Thaddeus read the formal criminal charges aloud. Federal financial wire fraud, grand larceny, conspiracy, and systematic elder exploitation. Every single piece of evidence had already been meticulously collected and secured. The high-definition recording of their conversation outside the house, the detailed banking records showing Saskia's unauthorized cash withdrawals of $62,000, the pending transfer request, attempting to steal $300,000 from my retirement fund, and most importantly, the mental competency petition they had pressured me to sign. The document carrying a childish block letter signature and an intentionally misspelled middle name was the final undeniable proof of coercion. Dorian stood frozen, his face turned the color of cold ashes. He looked at me with wild, desperate eyes, and then he began to weep. He fell to his knees, begging for my forgiveness, claiming that Saskia had manipulated him. that she was the true architect of the plan, and crying out that he was still my only son. He reached out to grab the hem of my trousers, his face wet with tears of terror, begging me to remember his mother, begging me to save him from this nightmare. I looked down at him, my heart feeling as cold and unyielding as winter ice. The bond between a father and a son is not a physical constant. It is a structure that requires careful, mutual maintenance from both sides. The very moment Dorian agreed to lock me away in a secure facility to consume my wealth, the final load-bearing support beam of our relationship had permanently snapped. "You didn't think about your mother, Dorian," I said, my voice a quiet, freezing whisper that cut through his crying. "You didn't think about her when you agreed to lock me in a cage for her money." I turned my head away, refusing to meet his eyes. The police officers stepped forward, the sharp metallic click of handcuffs echoing through the quiet office. They cuffed Saskia first, her hands pulled behind her back as she spat curses at me. And at that exact same moment, an emergency notification arrived from the Real Estate Licensing Board. Saskia's professional real estate license had been permanently revoked. Her career was over, and her future had officially disappeared behind the heavy steel doors of a federal prison. As they were escorted out of the building, every single trace of high society elegance and arrogance vanished. Only a raw, screaming panic remained. The moment they reached the concrete sidewalk outside, the fake mask of love they had worn for years shattered completely. Saskia turned toward Dorian and began screaming at him with a wild, animalistic fury, calling him weak, pathetic, and spineless. Dorian did not remain silent. He furiously blamed her insatiable greed for dragging them both into this absolute disaster. The two people who had once promised to stand by each other forever were now tearing each other apart like wild beasts on the street. Their beautiful, expensive structure was crushing itself under its own weight, without any further help from me. Pedestrians stopped on the sidewalk to watch the spectacle, some pointing, others recording the screaming match on their phones. It was the most satisfying clean structural collapse I had ever witnessed in my entire life. I stood on the steps of Pacific Crest Realty, looking down at the wreckage. My controlled demolition had succeeded exactly as planned. But as the dust finally settled and the sirens faded into the distance, another question remained. What was I supposed to do with the rest of my life? The doors of the police cruiser slammed shut, and Dorian and Saskia were carried away toward the county detention facility. As the vehicle disappeared from sight, I realized that it was finally time to make the last decision of my own life. The sound of the sirens gradually faded into the distance and disappeared into the crowded city streets. The noise was gone. All that remained was me and the clean, sweet air of freedom. I returned home, gathered the precious memories of Genevieve that were worth keeping, and made the decision to sell the old house. It was a beautiful structure, but it was tied to too many painful cracks in the foundation. I packed my bags, started my truck, and moved to a peaceful, rugged mountain region, a place surrounded by ancient, towering pine trees that stood firm against the endless winds. Every day I sit on the porch of my small wooden cabin, looking out at the sun rising over the peaks. Using the engineering knowledge I had gained over 30 years of hard work, I began designing a brand new structure. It is a beautiful charitable home for orphaned children, a safe haven funded entirely by my $900,000. I wanted to use that money to build strong, unshakable foundations for young lives that had been dealt a difficult hand, children who truly understand the value of love, family, and gratitude. I watched them running around the sunlit garden, their laughter filling the clean mountain air, and for the first time in 3 years, I felt a deep, warm peace settle into my chest. I had built a structure that would stand for generations. Thank you for spending this time with Whispered Truths. Don't forget to share your own story in the comments, and be sure to like and subscribe so you won't miss the next hard-earned lesson. My life now is simple, peaceful, and filled with a deep, quiet tranquility. As I look at the detailed engineering drawings spread across my wooden desk, I realize a profound truth. In construction, defective material cannot repair itself. Life is no different. When betrayal has corroded a relationship all the way to its core, trying to cover it up with wallpaper only guarantees the catastrophic collapse of the entire structure. Unconditional love does not mean unconditional surrender. A good father is someone who knows how to protect those he loves, but he must also have the courage to tear away the parasites that are consuming his family from within. Always keep the moral foundation of your life strong, steady, and unyielding, no matter how tempting the pressures around you may be.